No role plays, no conference calls, no BS. Chris and Lorenzo share 4 decades of combined experience to help you become a more effective leader. This is Hacking Your Leadership.
Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lorenzo.
And Lorenzo, before we get into this episode, I was looking at the calendar and I just realized that we are starting our 7th year of Hacking Your Leadership. We've been doing this for an entirety of 6 years now.
It's crazy to me. I think I was having a conversation with somebody the other day about this, and they were asking about the podcast, and I shared the link with them, and they were like, wow, like you've been doing this for a long time and have a lot of episodes. And it's surreal that we've done it for this long, and we continue to have I think good content, great conversations, because there's always something to talk about when it comes to leadership. But it is quite the milestone for sure.
Yeah, what I found online basically says that we're in the top 100th of 1% of podcasts in terms of longevity. Just starting a show and having it continue uninterrupted, consistent episodes for more than 6 years. Less than 1/100th of 1% of podcasts actually reach that. And, I think it's a testament to loving what we talk about. I get asked all the time, what's the secret to doing this for this long and to have this many episodes and this many positive reviews? It's picking a topic that I would talk about anyway, even if no one was listening and even if there were no sponsors and even nothing. We just want to talk about this stuff. If you can do that, then I think there's no shortage to how many listeners will come along for the ride.
Yeah, I saw a quote the other day that said Hacking Your Leadership is the best leadership podcast in the history of the world. It was by Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
So everything is true on the internet.
100%. He knew what he was talking about. He did a lot of good things, including talking about our show.
That's correct.
Yeah. On this episode, I want to talk about the fact that a couple weeks ago, I took my daughter to see the Barbie movie. Have you seen this yet?
I have not seen this yet. Fortunately, my girls are too young, I think, for that movie right now, so we have not had to watch that movie yet.
You'll see it eventually. Yeah.
Eventually, I'm sure. Yep.
Yeah. There's a scene in the movie where, and I'll give a spoiler alert. This isn't a major plot point, but if you don't want any spoilers, then maybe skip ahead a minute. There's a scene where Barbie is disenfranchised with how the real world is working in terms of its support of women. And so she goes to Mattel to talk to the CEO, who she believes is a woman, gets to the boardroom and realizes that the boardroom is, including the CEO, is full of white males. And that does not go over very well. But one of the things I think the writers of the film did well is they painted these room of white men who are talking to Barbie as having, kind of they're well-meaning in their heart. Like they didn't yell at her or demean her. They almost defended themselves, saying, we got these roles because we love women. We want to see women empowered. We've dedicated our lives to empowering women. And you hear them say this, and you can tell that they believe that what they're saying, but none of their actions support it. None of the people in the room are women. They haven't surrounded themselves with the right people. They haven't. You can say you believe something, but if you don't actually back it up with actions, then how can you say that you intend to do something? You can't. Your beliefs have to line up with your intent and your actions in order to make this happen. And I like the way that the writers did this in this movie. I think this is really important to talk about because I know of people who have said that they believe this and this and this, but then if you watch them and you watch who's in the room with them when decisions are being made, and you watch who the people are that they've hired or that they believe is their group of people they can hire from, it doesn't match what they've said. And at some point you have to start saying, do you really believe this? Or are you trying to convince yourself of this? I like the way this was portrayed in the movie and not just like a caricature of an angry boss.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great, conversation to have, because I think that we say a lot of things in your actions should, model your beliefs and all that type of stuff. And we talk a lot about from leadership around like role modeling the behaviors and leading from the front and all these things that we talk about. But really, that's what it boils down to so much, is looking at people's actions and then really having an opinion on what they really mean to do. And I have a mentor of mine who would say that leaders vote with their time.
Oh, yes.
And I love that idea of like wherever you spend your time is showing your people what you prioritize and what you care about most. And is it in an office? Is it filling out spreadsheets? Is it with your team? Is it side by side? Is it in development conversations? Like wherever you're spending your time really, really shows your people what you prioritize and what your intentions truly are. And I think that this example in the movie is so good and relevant because I know we've talked about it in the podcast before. I think I've done like Thoughtful Thursdays about it, but around this idea of like unconscious bias versus conscious bias. And like once you're aware that there's an issue here, it's no longer unconscious. And you now have the obligation to make a change if you truly have the belief and intention, or you just say that you believe. I believe that leadership is empowering and that it inspires people to be better every day. But when I talk to your people, you know what I better hear? That they feel empowered and they feel inspired to be better every day. And then if I don't, to your point, it's just a belief. You're not actually doing the behaviors to make that come to life. And that can be hard because we don't talk a lot about how do you build in, kind of like feedback loops where you can make sure and validate that in fact what you believe and what you intend to do is actually having the impact that you want it to have.
I love that you put it in the context of conscious versus unconscious bias because you actually see the moment in the movie where the words that Barbie is saying is, kind of pulling these men's heads out of the sand a little bit, and they react very poorly to having their heads pulled out of the sand. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I've always believed that unconscious bias is what it is. If it's unconscious, it truly is unconscious. There's no way to completely eliminate that. But the moment you're called out on it, you can no longer call it unconscious bias. Now it is conscious bias if the path continues. And so when called out on these things, on the fact that there were no women in the room, they didn't react by saying, "Oh my gosh, she's right." They reacted by becoming very hostile towards her because she didn't just believe what they were saying to her about their commitment to empowering women. That's when you know whether or not someone's intentions are real, is when they're met with a moment, a crossroads, if you will, of you call out the unconscious bias in a way that is not attacking, but is just, hey, you should be aware of this. If they react with oh my gosh, you're 100% right, let's explore this more, that's a person who is well-intentioned and well-meaning. If a person reacts very poorly to that with some cognitive dissonance, then it means that what they've attempted to do is surround themselves with people who will allow them to have their unconscious bias and never feel called out and uncomfortable because of it. That's the real difference between someone who's committed to making these changes and someone who isn't. The other thing you said that I liked was about leaders voting with their time. The political quote I've always heard is, "Don't tell me what's important to you. Show me your budget, and I'll tell you what's important to you." This is the exact same thing. And there's no. The only way to erode the trust with your people is to have your words and your actions not align. If as a leader, what's important to you is sitting in the office on calls and letting other people work with your people instead, if you say that and then you do that, then let the chips fall where they may. People can decide whether or not they like you as a leader or not. The issues come when the words you're saying and the actions that you do don't align. And typically when that happens, it means you know that your actions aren't necessarily the right actions and you should be doing something differently. Otherwise, why wouldn't you just say that, right? If you're saying this is what's important to you, you need to be taking inventory of what your actions are to make sure they align with that, because your people see it the moment it happens. And you can hide your head in the sand all you want to, but you're not gonna put your people's heads in the sand next to you.
Yeah, and I think that, in the movie, kind of how you explained it, and we've talked about this over the handful of years now, but the power of the internet and communication and how it's creating transparency across workforces and teams and leaders and whatnot is there's this moment now where people have to get getting really used to that. Like there's an element of accountability that's happening with leaders and organizations around the actions that they take. Mm-hmm. And again, I know in the typical news cycle and everywhere that you read, we're only going to talk about the big extreme ones. right?
Right.
Like, oh, this thing happened and like half of the people hate it, half of the people love it. And let's talk about that because people get clicks, right? I'm not talking about those big things. I'm talking about, the moments when companies or leaders of companies say, hey, we're committed to this. This is the thing that we're focused on. We're going to make change here. And then you don't see that change happen, right? And then people are now bringing that up and they're talking about that and they're looking to have more accountability in some of these spaces. And I think that that's a good thing overall. I think that that's really from a localized standpoint, that's what happens with teams every day and leaders of teams every day, is that you're either building trust and you're building, equity in the relationship of leading a team by the actions that you have every day, or you're eroding it and you're reducing it because of the actions that you're doing where you're not living up to the commitments that you make. So I think that there's a lot of this that's happening in a lot of spaces. And from a leadership standpoint, you have to be aware of it. You got to be conscious of it. You got to make sure that when you're making commitments to your people and to your teams, that you are following up on those commitments, that you're sharing, what you're doing or how you're validating the commitments that you're making, just as much of what you're asking of them to make commitments to you.
Yeah, that's so true. I think there's a very real business case for this too, and I don't want to reduce this to a business case because these are the right things to do from a people standpoint. But even if you are not committed to doing this because it's the right thing to do from the people standpoint, the business case is very compelling here in terms of making the right strategic decisions based on who your customers are and based on having the right people in the room to help influence and affect those decisions. I'm reminded of a really poorly written advertisement that H&M did with clothing.
I remember this. We talked about it.
We talked about this, a few years ago. And you could tell that nobody in that room ever thought it was going to be an issue. They never thought about it. There wasn't any evidence that anybody in that room was ill-intentioned, but there was plenty of evidence that a lot of people in that room were ill-informed.
Yeah.
and
ignorant.
And ignorant. And at the end of the day, there's no difference between the two when it comes to how the public will perceive you. Ill-informed and ignorant, combined with it happened only once and there's an extreme apology, you'll probably get through it. But the actions have to change along with that so people can tell that you realize, oh my gosh, this happened because of this, this, and this, and we're taking steps to make sure that'll never happen again. You'll probably get through that fine. But if you don't take those steps, if it's just an apology without the actions to go alongside it, not only will people not take your apology seriously, but you'll make the same mistake again. It's just a matter of time. Whether it's 2 weeks or 2 years, you'll make the same mistake again. And so having the right people in the room is the way to influence the right strategic business decisions and to make sure this doesn't happen. Because you want to talk about having the benefit of the doubt by the rest of your employees and the public. Make sure that when a decision comes out, if they look at the people in the room and they go, I wonder how they got through that, you'll get some grace. If they look at the room and they go, oh, well, that's why that decision was made, then that means you're already going to be working from a negative to try to kind of restore that trust.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad that you called out like the kind of the business side of things, because you're spot on. Every bit of research and every bit of anything that I've read about this, and it makes total sense when you think about it. Like, it makes 100% complete sense. If you have people around you that see the world differently, that have different opinions, that have different approaches, different ways of working, different thoughts, different backgrounds, whatever it might be, the more you have of that, if that room is aligned from a value standpoint, we share the same values, we have a belief that we are all here to do the best work that we can do, and we trust one another to challenge one another in a respectful way, but a way that helps us to progress the work. When you have that, the business is always better. Like it's always better. It outpaces everything. And that makes complete sense to any of us that have ever worked with other people that have helped us to see things differently, to refine things, to challenge things. And we're like, man, I'm so glad they gave me that input. I'm so glad I had that coach in the sport that I was in and they helped me fix this thing. I'm so glad that I had that one teacher, that one professor that challenged me to think a little bit differently about something and they made me a better this or that. Like, there are so many of those moments that are critical that we make total sense to us. It's the same thing when you look in a team, and especially a team of leaders, that you have to know that there's enough differences there to challenge the best ideas to make them even better.
And it makes sense in the movie because the younger generation of girls, elementary, middle school, and high school girls, they don't care about Barbie and they don't like Barbie. And they think that she's representative of something that is unattainable and unrealistic, and they're not wrong. And if you look at who's in the boardroom, it makes sense that the decisions would be made that way, not in spirit of who the customer is. So they align in a truly one-to-one fashion. You get the right people in the room that represent the people you are trying to serve, trying to market to, whether it's for whatever reason you're trying to do it. Get the right people in the room, and you will have the right business outcomes that come from it.
Absolutely. And with that, it brings us to this episode's 1-minute hack. But first, a few words from our sponsors.
All right, for this episode's 1-minute hack, here's what I want you to do. I want you to get out a pen and paper, and I want you to write down 3 of your core values. And they don't necessarily have to be related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They can be any core values. Write down 3 core values that if you were to say, I want people to know me by these things. I want people to, when they think of me, I want them to think of these 3 values that I espouse. Write those things down. And then after you write them down, I want you to write down all of the actions that you've taken over the last 90 days in spirit of those 3 values, the things that you've done every day that align with those values, so evidence, so to speak, of the fact that these are your 3 values. If you can write down a lot of bullet points for each of them, then great, you're on track, keep doing it. Try to expand that as much as you can and try to make sure that your values are aligned with the values of your people, and you'll continue to be a good leader. If you can't find a lot of examples of this, then they're not values, they're just things you want to believe about yourself. The moment they are not actionables, the moment you don't have the behaviors to back them up, they can't be considered your values. They're just things that you would like to believe about yourself. So take steps to start making changes in your life every day in spirit of those 3 values, or change them. If they're not fitting with you, if you can't find a way to act in spirit of them, then do some soul searching on what your values actually are. Because again, if you want the trust and the support of your people, the words and the actions need to align. That's more important than whatever the values are to begin with. The words and the actions need to align.
Yeah, I think it's a great 1-minute hack, and there's a practice that I always like to do with leaders around that element of alignment of the aspirational version of yourself versus the actual way you show up for people. And I think that's so important that we are thinking about that at all times. Like, our behaviors align with the values that we have? Are we staying true to who we are and how and where we spend our time? And are we making sure that even in the times when maybe you're not spending as much time in the values that you want to because other things are going on or the workload is heavy, that we take the time to pause and think about that, but also spend the time with our teams. I think you might have said this earlier, but just being clear around owning mistakes, or being clear around providing the examples of making sure that our teams know that we'll get more grace when we learn the lesson, when we share that we've learned the lesson, and then we change our behaviors to not make that mistake again. And I think that this is an example of like building the foundation elements of self-reflection to make sure that we are truly aligned with what we want to bring to the world and bring to our teams.
Right. I like what you said about time, because you're right. And you said at the beginning, show me your leaders vote with their time, show me your time budget, and I'll tell you what the priorities are. This is less about that and more about making sure you're not doing anything that is an opposite of what you say. Meaning sometimes the priorities change of your organization. Sometimes the big thing of the moment gets in the way of doing most of what you'd like to do. As long as what you end up doing in the moment is not does not work against what your values are. Meaning sometimes you have more time to spend on the things that are most important to you than others. As long as you aren't spending time doing things that are in direct opposition to what your values are, your people will give you the grace. It's when you start doing things that don't not only don't align with your values, but they go in exactly the opposite way of what you say your values are. That's when you lose people to the point of not being able to get that relationship back.
Absolutely. And with that, it brings us to the end of this episode. This is Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Lorenzo.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you all next time.